Those that are in the language realm really have a sense of both the excitement and the vulnerability of the language learning experience, of the language using experience. My guest for this episode is James Mattiace. James actually wrote to me saying that he felt that my previous guests have more insight than he was able to share, which is such a typical thing for a person that loves language to say about themselves. There's a basic humility that comes by applying our human desire to be amazing at things to something as mystical and as essential to the human experience as language. When we learn language at the speed of being human, we come into the situations that life has brought us and take the chance to make connections. We explore how others think, how others learn, how others relate. James draws on this lived experience from being in over 8 countries. We reflect on language as a system and its non-linear nature, its deep embed in the human spirit. Enjoy this podcast because this is an opportunity for you too to connect to the amazing magic of language and also sometimes those challenges we feel in our spirit because language is so amazing and so powerful. What do you like about Costa Rica? What do you like about living there? That's very interesting to find out from you.
This is my 8th country that I've resided in for, longer than a vacation. So this is, so we're pretty used to the adjustment, like getting in, how to, make all the necessary things happen because I'm fluent in Spanish and I also lived in Panama for 7 years. So I have an understanding of Central American culture, although not to imply that Costa Rican culture and Panamanian culture are interchangeable, but there are similarities being neighboring countries. However, I've always recently started describing Costa Rica to my Panamanian friends as Costa Rica's Panama on Valium.
Valium.
The people are incredibly nice. There's the ethos of the country. They have this concept called a rural democracy, where that, according to the founding legend, every country has their founding legends, right? According to the Costa Rican founding legend, when the Spanish came, the country was so hard to farm that the Spaniards had to work in collaboration with the indigenous. Now, there's lots of evidence to suggest that the Spaniards wiped out a lot of the indigenous or forced them out or disease, right? So it's not like everybody was happy. But the founding legend here is that there's this spirit of cooperation that exists from the country's colonial origins that thrives today in their political life. So it's kind of an interesting founding story. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of indigenous counter narrative because they were pushed out and not absorbed into the community like they are in Guatemala or in southern Mexico. The Costa Ricans are much more European in their appearance than other countries in Central America. But that's kind of blended in with their founding myth as well. It's just interesting. But anyway, very environmentally conscious. They don't have an army. There's lots of very progressive things about the country. However, the current government is center-right and very Christian-oriented. So we shall see.
Do you think that you used a phrase back there that I think I'm going to get a little bit wrong, James, which is about like a kind of a democratic aspect or a cooperative?
Yeah, they call it rural democracy, rural democratic philosophy, I think, or rural democratic politics. There's a third word in it that they use to describe the origin of Costa Rican settlement, post Columbus settlement. And it refers to the concept of that the life was so hard that they had to cooperate in order to get food on the table, in order to plant and grow, because it's so mountainous.
Yeah. From what I understand too, that in Costa Rica, unlike in some other areas, decisions were made fairly early on to not to make sure that land was not all gathered up by some wealthy individuals and not allowed to be used by the great bulk of the people, but that there were some policies put into place that helped to make sure that people had access to land and therefore some ongoing wealth, of personal value.
Yeah.
Is that true?
I don't know if there are policies put in place. I know that, I mean, the coffee plantation owners and the banana plantation owners definitely made their share of wealth. Like there is clear, I mean, there are family names that are very well connected to that sort of wealth. And there are also other family names that are well connected to the post 1990s sort of economic boom that happened here related to tourism and the influx of Western conveniences that came in. Like, there's my apartment, the guy who owns my apartment that we rent from, his dad was the owner of this massive chain of convenience stores, which they sold to Walmart and made millions of dollars, right? So like that's here for sure. I will say, having traveled just a bit around the country, we've only been here since July, so I can't profess any concrete knowledge of the geography, but you don't see in Panama, when you left Panama City, you saw immediate rural poverty, like immediate. And it was the distribution of wealth in the country was very much, Panama City had all the wealth. It had all the initiatives. It had, when the electricity went off, Panama City got their electricity back on first. Other people would have to wait 2 or 3 weeks. Here, and there's also a racial component to that too, because the Caribbean side of the country is very black, West Indian, African, Jamaican, Afro-Antillean. And so there's also that element that goes along with it, of course, and unfortunately in every culture. Here, when we traveled, we drove 5 hours west to the Pacific and north. We went to the Pacific Northwest of Costa Rica. I didn't see that rural poverty. It seemed to be, there was like shacks, there was definitely not palatial mansions, but it looked like the rural communities as we went through them had a very nice distribution of income. Now, who knows? We were on the main roads, right? Who knows if you went, 10 feet into the jungle, what you're going to find. So
still, first
and the other
impressions.
issue is the gentrification with Americans and Canadians coming down here and retiring and raising the prices for everybody, which is frequently discussed and is a major topic in the presidential election, which happens on February 1st. So.
Wow, that's almost right there. You mentioned 8 countries total, James, that you have lived in?
Yeah, this is our 8th that we've
would you name them? Could you name them for me, please?
I can, yeah. Well, there's a country, United States of America, Morocco, Panama, Taiwan, Colombia, Spain, Mexico, and then Costa Rica. So
why don't you tell my listeners who you are, what you have done, and what you consider to be some of your, I would say, key identity aspects with regard to language. Why are we talking today?
Oh, yes. Awesome. I would say, you had a previous guest on a couple episodes ago. It was Paul Frank, who was talking about his evolution, like growing up in multilingual, or at least in communities where he was exposed to other languages other than the one that you spoke at home. And I grew up in New York City, in the suburbs of New York City. For listeners who are from New York City, I don't mean to offend. I grew up in the suburbs. I grew up in Westchester County. Yes, but we didn't have cows. Just want to be clear. But I went to high school in the Bronx, so I think I have some legitimacy there. But, New York is such a melting pot of languages and cultures. And so I was surrounded by these languages and cultures, but I didn't speak them. Like I wasn't forced, because I was largely immigrant communities that were trying to assimilate. On my block alone, we had a Roma family, we had a Polish family. These were all like fresh, just recently arrived. We had an Indian family, I think they were Bengali. We had a Russian family, German Jews who'd been there forever. It's just a mix of cultures that were on my block, right? But everybody was striving to assimilate and speak English. So I wasn't necessarily meeting Russian kids and learning Russian, although I did attempt to learn Japanese when I was in 5th grade from one of my classmates. But also in 5th grade, we had a Vietnamese family arrived. This was 84, 85. So it wasn't, I wouldn't consider them boat people, but they may have been like, migratory boat people. Like they'd landed on the West Coast and then moved over. And I remember we had these 2 kids show up to school one day. They were Vietnamese, spoke no English. And my teacher asked, does anybody want to help them with their English? And I said, I'll do it. And so I went home. My dad had served in Vietnam. He was a Green Beret in Vietnam. So I asked him if he had any Vietnamese language books. So he gave me the field guide that soldiers were given for when they went and encountered Vietnamese people. And so the whole book was like, are there any VC in the village? Where are the weapons? Have you seen any
5th grade stuff, right?
So So the phrase book wasn't really super useful for me communicating with these Vietnamese guys, but I did, and I kind of took them as my language partners and attempted to learn a little bit of Vietnamese. But really, I only say this just because I was thinking about what Paul Frank was saying, is I didn't have that experience as a kid where I was always exposed to other languages and learning them. But like I said, I tried to learn Japanese. We're integrated with this Vietnamese family. But it was really in high school. I took Latin, and then took French, and then I taught in Oregon in a very predominantly Mexican migrant school. And we had a large number of kids coming through with their families during various harvest seasons. And so I, started picking up Spanish just to be able to communicate with my students, but could only speak in the present tense and only about very limited topics. But yeah, it was just, but I had an affinity for it. I had the Latin background. So, I took Latin for 8 years. I taught it for 2 years. So I had that sort of romance language hook to hang Spanish on. And I had the French. So anyway, I moved to Morocco to teach at an American school in Morocco, and my French got reignited. But then I started learning Moroccan Darija, which is Moroccan Arabic, which is, for your listeners, but for your listeners, Moroccan Darija is as similar to Arabic as Cuban Spanish is to Castilian Spanish, right? So there's lots of slang, lots of words that are cut, and there's also, they mix in French and English and Spanish. So I can understand Arabic, but they can't understand me because I speak a patois sort of version. But anyway, I did that for 6 years, became fluent in Darija, and then accepted a job in Panama. So went to intensive Spanish courses and then started learning Spanish by watching the news in Spanish, and then became fluent in Spanish, which again, the Latin background helped, the French background helped. And they did that for 7 years, and then went to Taiwan. And then Taiwan was interesting because Taiwan, as soon as I arrived at the school in Taiwan, I knew I was leaving. Like I knew I was going to do my 2-year contract and leave. It was just an immediate mismatch. I was the upper school principal, and it was an immediate mismatch with the director of the school, the head of school. Like just from even before day one, I was like, this is not going to work. And so I knew I was leaving I was going to finish my contract. I would honor my contract. But so I'd been learning Mandarin over the summer before I accepted the position. And as soon as I got there, that willpower just kind of went out the window. Like I really decided, I almost actively resisted it, which is weird. I mean, I would still do Duolingo, and like I would attempt to learn, but I just kind of like shut down. I was just like, this language, I'm not staying here. And it's sort of almost like a mini protest. I was like, I'm not going to learn this language.
Interesting.
I picked up basics, right? But
it's interesting.
But it goes to that. Some of that goes to that concept of motivation for students who want to learn a language. Like you never know who's in your class or who's in your program, and maybe they really don't want to be there, and they just are just going to rebel by pushing back against the language. That was kind of, in hindsight, it was stupid. I could have used the 2 years to really immerse myself in the language, but
it sure
the other thing too is
illustrates the humanity of language. If you are not
absolutely
happy with the humans, the language is that connection, and you're not interested. So please continue.
Yeah, and I knew I wasn't going to be making long-term friends with Taiwanese people because we weren't going to be there a lot. And Taiwanese people are also very, there's a cultural, like they don't have a culture of inviting people over to houses. It's very, like you meet out in public in restaurants. It's not that same culture that Morocco is the exact opposite, where everybody invites you to their house. And so I just, utility wise, it was just like, okay, I'm not going to focus on this. But yeah. And then just bounced, Colombia, Spain, Mexico. I always get flagged in Mexico for my Central American accent, which I think is really cool. Like I'm always, whenever somebody's like, are you from Panama? I say, yeah. So not from, but I like that. I picked up the accent, the regionalisms. But while I was in Mexico, I really decided I wanted to learn Nahuatl, which most people in English pronounce it Nahuatl, but I'm going to be a pedant and pronounce it the way the Aztecs pronounced it, or the way the language pronounces it, which is Nahuatl. And the TL makes us sound like a bus coming to a stop. So I'm also the same guy who pronounces Budapest and Chile. So, I do those things, which,
pedant that you might be.
People.
Keep it going there, James. Keep it going.
Yeah. I try not to correct people too often, but anyway. I decided I wanted to learn Nahuatl more primarily just because there's an opportunity to learn it. Mexico is obviously the home to the language. There's 1.5 million people who still speak it. So I started going and learning that language on Saturdays at a community center, but the course was taught in Spanish. So I was learning a third language in a second language, which was really, I thought, interesting from a pedagogical, but also from a sort of a philosophical perspective, right? To think about those concepts that we have that are tied to a language, but then when you change the concept, when you change the language, the concept changes as well.
I'm going to go. Yes, give us an example, James. You got to take us down a couple rabbit trails here, please.
Yeah, for sure. I love this stuff. So when I was in class, my classmates, none of whom ever revealed that they spoke English or a language other than Spanish. They may have been polyglots, but nobody ever revealed that in class. And the professor was fluent Nahuatl speaker and fluent Spanish, but not an experienced language teacher. So he was just kind of like sharing Nahuatl with us. So, I mean, the classes I never took notes by day because it would, oh my gosh, we would just leap from concept to concept. It's all over the place. But because I had studied enough languages, I knew like I needed a page dedicated to pronouns. I needed a page dedicated to verb constructions. I needed a page dedicated to tense. So I would shuffle in my notebook as we would jump through these things. But so yeah, there were some concepts that were interesting. Because I had studied Arabic, they use this subjective object at the end of a word to indicate who it's happening to, right? And so I had studied Arabic, so I picked that up right away. But my classmates, that was a new concept for them. So I was kind of breezing along, and they were struggling with that one. But then when he got into cognates, and he would refer to all these cognates that were tied to Spanish that I maybe didn't have a firsthand experience with. Like, for example, the concept in Spanish, they have a word tocayo, which means to have the same name as somebody else. And it means you have the exact same name, right? So like Norah Jones, the other Norah Jones, and you are tocayo. Like you have the same name. We don't have that concept in English. We don't have a word for it. Namesake is probably the closest we get to. So he was trying to explain this. He was like, tocayo, he was using the Nahuatl word. And he was like, oh, it's tocayo. And I was like, I don't know this word. Like I hadn't learned that word yet or the concept. And then he asked me and I was like, well, we have like junior or like names. I was like, we don't have that idea in English. Or like he was describing what I thought he was describing the verb to learn, because all the examples you were using involved this one word. And he was talking about, but really what it was is in Nahuatl, they have this concept of places of learning. So really he was talking about school, but I thought it was a verb and he was talking about a noun, right? So like those kinds of things were just fun to get through. But the best one was in class, for those who don't speak Spanish, the verb to like is gustarse. It's reflexive, right? So if something you say, if you want to say I like it, you say me gusta. It pleases me, right? Me gusta. Use the third person, like it pleases me. So all of my Spanish speaking colleagues, that's how they understood that reflexive concept of something being it. They may not think through it like in terms of what the literal construction is, but they get that it's a reflexive verb. In Nahuatl, the whole concept of liking something has to do with proximity. So they use this word called neshpaktia, which is a compound word, which means to be in the presence of something that gives you joy, right? And so you have neshpaktia, like you have this neshpaktia. And so this was like my colleague, like I didn't have a problem with it because I wasn't wedded to the reflexive verb concept. Like I had already learned that concept. So I was like, okay, there's another way of saying liking something. I can do that. And like in Arabic, in Moroccan Arabic, like they use when you're saying that you want something, you say it in the past tense, even though you mean in the present. Like when you go into stories, like I wanted that. So, but even though you're communicating in the present, so I, like those kinds of things didn't throw me. But my classmates were like, "What? Like this is not possible." They're just going around and around. So it was a really fun metacognitive experience, but also a really fun just broadening of my understanding of languages, and then I get to be that guy who says no, it's pronounced Nahuatl. And then now I'm learning Amharic, which is very interesting.
Why is it interesting?
It's a simplified version of a language in the sense that they don't have all these questions. There's no interrogative case. Like you just ask. It's a tone similar to do in English. But the verbs are I'm still getting verbs are 3 letters, just like in Arabic. So that's easy, right? But then they change the vowels depending on what they're trying to communicate, past or present tense. This is my understanding right now. I can't profess to have a universal understanding. I'm 4 weeks in, right? So this is very basic, but they use the object subject as well. So they'll attach. So there's a great example. There's a word which means to enter. But if you put the object subject to me onto the verb, it then means to understand, because the whatever it was has entered you and now you understand. So that's cool. Like I was like, that's a really cool construction. So I'm eager to learn more of those. But it feels, going back to my Arabic, my Darija, it feels, there's no cognates that I've discovered yet. There probably will be. I'm sure there will be, just by proximity to the Middle East and trade routes and everything else. I'm sure there will be cognates, but I feel like I can pick up the language with an Arabic background faster than I would with any other background. So it's a cool. I'm going to Ethiopia in March, so we'll test it. We'll see how I do.
This is okay. So you have, I mean, what you've described is fascinating. First of all, clearly there's a dedication to saying, and what new is around the corner, and it has revealed many things to you, folks. Most of the folks, I think, in my listening audience are folks that are well aware of the fact that languages are expressions of people's perception of the world and the kinds of things that they want to do in the world, how they feel that the world works. You have quite a bottle cap collection here, James. And what is it that it has done for how you work in the world, what you do in the world, how you think it provides options and insights that help you to help others in the world? What has the diversity and the perspectives of language done for you then, as a person who also works in the world and cares about the world?
It's a great question. And I'd actually be curious to hear your own perspective on this. I think you, first of all, not your own language journey, but also you get to have all these amazing conversations with all of these other people who are doing this. And I'm curious how that has influenced your perspective on language and how people move through the world, having heard all these stories, which we get to share with you by listening to the podcast. So I'll just give a brief, my only contribution to this conversation would be that I have a very high tolerance for people who make mistakes in my native language. Like I would say that's one aspect of it. I was born without shyness. So I'm I have no problem talking to people and screwing it up and figuring it out. And I think that's one obstacle that a lot of people struggle with when they are learning a language. They don't want to screw it up and they don't want to be embarrassed. I don't have that emotion. So I'm happy to go and just jump in and try it. And I think the other thing I would say is it's helped me make, when I see connections between cultural things or things that are not necessarily connected but are divergent, and I can share that with. So when I was learning, I guess when I was learning the Nahuatl, we were talking in class about, I don't remember what it had to do with gender. But no, I remember it was. Sorry, it was they have the concept. So Spanish has like aquí, like here, or acá, allá, right, or ahí, there, aquello, which is like far away, right? They have those concepts. And in Nahuatl, they have two. They have here and not here. Like it's gone. It's like there's no like it's over there. It's like it's not. The way he was describing it was he would go around the room and touch things and say, this is here. He's like, but he would point to something that was within reach, but he couldn't touch it. He's like, and that's gone. Like, so that's, so I was able to share that in Benin, they have a concept of, I haven't seen you since yesterday. I haven't seen you since 3 days. And if it's been more than 3 days, I have not seen you in forever. Like, it's like you are, if it's longer than 3 days, I don't know what happened to you, man. You could be dead. You are gone forever. So I was able to share that kind of concept of time relating to distance, like just a different. Yeah, that's, and also Arabic has the same thing. Like they have 1 day, 2 days, and 3 or more days. Those are different versions of the noun. And so it's just like I don't know what it is about the 3. Like maybe ancient travel patterns, like 3 days was enough to get to see somebody, and if you didn't see them 3 days, then who knows what happened to that person? They're out of sight, out of mind. So yeah, so being able to, I like that connection. But really, I think it's the tolerance for people who are struggling to learn any language that I speak, and be And that translated into my career as an educator because there's this strong push in international schools, and we can dive into the politics later, of, parents are paying for English language education. They want English all the time. There's no tolerance for English languages other than English being spoken in the classrooms. And so as an administrator in schools, I had to sort of walk that line between, okay, this is what the parents are demanding, and then how can I compassionately allow students to speak the languages and use translanguaging. And the way I could do that authentically was say, hey, I speak all these languages. I understand that there's a value in immersing yourself in English, but I also get that sometimes I want to use French words when the English words don't work. So let's try for English as the language of inclusion and the language of common language, but also educate your friends as to what the words that you're trying to use, how those could be used by them as well. So I think that I came across as authentically trying to uphold a policy that I disagreed with because the parents wanted it, and trying to educate the parents as well. And then coming across as a language enthusiast and saying, like, let's just have all the languages and learn from each other and not be exclusive with their language. So I think that's how that kind of fit into my career. Now, there may be a teacher out there who worked for me who's going to go, that jerk was always enforcing the English language policy. And maybe they didn't see all the stuff I was doing behind the scenes to encourage the diversity of languages. But, whatever. You can't win them all.
I tend to use as wording for some of the things that I talk about with folks the idea that we have various tools that are in our toolbox. And that if we're going to build houses of language, that we don't throw out the hammer because we've learned how to use a wrench. We don't throw out the wrench because we've learned how to use a saw. We continue to collect our tools, put them in the toolbox, so we pull them out when we need them, and we're not trying to hammer in, say, a nail with the saw blade, but we get our hammer out at the time.
No, it's a perfect analogy.
And
that's a perfect analogy.
And I think that describe, if you would, what some of the strengths were, because you were administering as well as teaching. So you have these different levels, and I'm going to go to a third level in just a moment. But for the moment, take a look at how it felt to students and how parents and caregivers understood after a while the way that translanguaging works and what it can do for the learning and also the psychology of those that are employing it. Spend a little time telling us about translanguaging.
I don't know. I mean, definitely it's a third rail in a lot of places, the concept of translanguaging.
Mm-hmm.
So for the audience to know, I didn't teach language. Other than the 2 years I taught Latin, I was primarily a social science teacher. So I taught AP and IB economics, and then I taught global politics, political science, international relations. Right. I was teaching. All of my content was always delivered in English, with trying to make connections to students' worlds through using other words for things. But it's primarily in English in international schools, and also taught in U.S. public schools. But the concept of translanguaging, I've always tried to depoliticize that word by saying it's about making meaning. And if whatever student needs to make meaning, isn't that the most important thing? Who cares what language they do it in? Is the meaning being constructed? And then as the teacher, how can you validate that meaning is the correct meaning they've taken away, right? So there needs to be a check for understanding and a way for that to get presented, or evidence being given back to the teacher that the student understands the concept in whatever language they understand it in. And so that's how I've tried to de-escalate some of the conflicts that have come up with those teachers who would come into my office and say, this kid's always speaking in Chinese. I said, well, are they speaking Chinese because they're gossiping with their friend, or are they turning to their friend and asking their friend for an explanation so their friend can give them back the explanation in Chinese? Like, which is it? Because one is, that's a behavior, and that needs to be stopped because they shouldn't be gossiping in English, Chinese, Swahili, or whatever. Like they're not following the rules of the classroom. Or are they trying to make meaning? And once I would have that conversation with teachers without using the word translanguaging, because that didn't necessarily need to be thrown around, that tended to give those teachers a frame or a lens as to when they needed to call it out and when they needed to investigate to find out whether the meaning had been made, whether the evidence was there. So I think that's probably the best. And I would say now, not being in schools anymore, but working with educators. So I work with groups of teachers in refugee camps in Uganda, Kenya, and Jordan. And so we have the only accredited high school in the world. It's called Amala education. Refugees are able to achieve a high school diploma, an accredited high school diploma from NIASC and CS, and then go on to university or entrepreneurship or whatever from there. And so we have a very large language diversity in the classrooms. And the students are aged 16 to 24 years old and bring all of their lived experiences with them. So I do teacher training with the teachers to do pedagogy. 50% of our teachers are refugees, and the other 50% are young teachers, early career, who somehow thought it would be a good idea to go live in a refugee camp for a year. So I have a lot of basic pedagogy that we do, but language in the classroom comes up quite a bit. Because in the Kenyan camps, you'll have Somali and you'll have Swahili and you'll have other languages that are being spoken. Arabic is being spoken as well. And I try to present that same lens to them that these are students with, traumatic life experiences who are coming to school in English because they want to get a high school diploma, but they're wrestling with some difficult concepts because it's a fully accredited high school. And so let them figure it out. Just make sure that it's not being used to make fun of other students in the class, or to be used as a way to make the classroom uncomfortable for somebody else.
Hi, Norah Jones here. Please connect up with me on my website, fluency.consulting, to learn more about my guests, subscribe to know when podcasts, videos, and blogs are released, to let me know if you'd like to be a guest, to get Team Humanity gifts for yourself and others, and, if you can, to support my work with a donation. That's fluency.consulting. I deeply appreciate your listening and sharing. Where do you see the most hope in language in the world as we are living it right now and as we look into the future? What are those areas where you're like, language truly is going to be a beam of light that's going to help us to find a way? What are some of the elements that you see?
That's a really good question. I don't know when this is going to air, but as of right now, late January 2026, there's a lot of stuff happening with migrant communities in the United States. And I don't know when this airs, where that will have progressed or regressed to, but where I see there's been a lot of online activism encouraging people to normalize speaking Spanish in public, so that where there's migrant communities, that if people that look like you and I, which those who can't see the podcast, you and I look very white, that are walking around speaking Spanish in public, it destigmatizes those who are monolingual or very emerging bilinguals in English and Spanish. And so I like that tactic. So that's hopeful to me that people have recognized, we can use our Spanish ability to make the environment more comfortable for other people and to destigmatize them. So I thought that was I think it's a cool tactic. It's like, yeah, I thumbs up. It's as cool as the frog in Portland and, all the other various things that are out there.
That is an interesting strategy. Very, very effective, strikes me.
And it's also, at the same token, seeing on news reports, for example, very obviously white Minnesotans going and speaking in Spanish and also in Somali to people who are being under pressure, attack, whatever, from ICE agents, and going in and saying, I'm here as an outsider, but I can speak your language, because they took the time to figure that out. And that's cool too. Like, I see that's hopeful. Moving into broader picture, broader scope stuff. I don't know. I think there's a movement. The translanguaging movement in international schools is encouraging. It's way more progressive in international schools than it is in U.S. public schools. Movements towards home language support. A lot of schools really recognizing all of the assets that students bring with them with their home languages and trying to preserve those and partnering with community resources. I see this all the time in the international school community. Lots of schools are doing it right. There are still lots of schools that are still hanging their hat on that English language value for parents, and so they're less willing to do it. But as the more prestigious schools move into this space and aren't losing parents as a result, I think it becomes safer for other schools to do it. So that's encouraging, and that's positive and hopeful. And I'm not enough of a language person to be the expert or authority on translanguaging, whether that's the best strategy. I do know it's one of the more inclusive strategies, but I can't tell you what there's lots of research out there. If you don't immerse, do language instruction, I'll leave that to Greg Roberts and other people who are much more proficient in that to talk about it. It's not my area of expertise, and I will stay out of that. but it's just the tone that it sets, I think, is part of it.
Yeah.
And then, I don't know, I think hopeful language-wise, I think it's just I've been working for years to make bilingualism, multilingualism, a marketable skill, and that it becomes valuable, like just the growth in the global seal of biliteracy, just the number of people they're reaching now, they're putting that on their LinkedIn or their resume. They're going and getting the seal of biliteracy because it's seen as a valued thing to have. I see that as hopeful and a positive and a trend that I hope continues in that direction.
Thank you for bringing that up. And I did want to call attention to the fact that, for example, on your LinkedIn profile, the thing that you have up there is about assessment and specifically assessment reform. And yes, there are plenty of educators around the world that listen to this podcast, but there are also people for whom I would love for you, with your skill set, James, to broaden out what assessment means to people, what the role is of taking a look at benchmarking where people are when they were talking about something as key to humanity as language is. What kind of assessment and assessment reform and role of what that brings to people's hearts and minds, both the learner and those around them, can you share with us?
Sure. Well, first, I have to put on my Latin hat, and the word assessment comes from the Latin word assistere, which means to sit beside. So like the original concept of assessment and where we draw this root word is the professor or the docent or whoever sitting alongside the student and having an evolving conversation of that student's understanding. So just if we got back to that root of the word, that would be, an ideal case. Now, when you've got 35 students in front of you, in 40-minute blocks or 40-minute periods, that becomes a little bit more difficult, which argues that maybe we shouldn't have 35 students in front of you in 40-minute periods, but that's a separate argument. Yeah. But, those are tied together. I'm mostly pushing in the work I've done for assessment reform is around the concept of proficiency-based or standards-based, learning, moving towards competency-based, and that with languages specifically, language learning is not a linear process. We learn in fits and starts. We have plateaus, we have ebbs, we have regressions in language learning. I know for myself, whenever I go take a week-long intensive Spanish class, I actually come out poorer in Spanish for the first few days afterwards because I overthink everything. But it's like, am I supposed to be using the subjunctive now? Am I not supposed to be using? It's just you get all wacky. But we do. Those are language learning is not linear. So, but in schools, it's expected to be. You go chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, Spanish 1, Spanish 2, French 1, French 2, right? And so native French speakers would don't have grammar. Like there's all this other wrinkles that are in there. And so what I've argued for is the concept of proficiency based, that students achieve at certain levels in whatever subjects they're in, and they're assessed against those proficiency standards. So can you do the following? Yes, then that's where you are right now. More importantly, here's your success criteria or your learning progressions as to here's where you're going to go next. Like, and this is what it looks like when you can get to this next level. And so here are your internal goals. Right? That's the most basic, least arguable with concept. Now that when you throw that into a school and you say, okay, let's do that, then all of the other things come up and those are all arguable, right? Those are all, everybody can pick a corner and everybody can fight over it. And so my approach, having led 2 schools to a fully based standards-based grading and reporting, so not reporting grades, the traditional grades on a report card at all. And with the first school, it took 5 years to get to that point. And I spent the first year saying to the faculty that assessment is deeply personal. It's tied into every aspect of our job as teachers. It dictates our classroom behavior management plans. It dictates how we structure the day. Assessment is part and parcel of everything. And I said, I'm not going to tell you you're doing it wrong. We're just going to have a year-long conversation about why we grade and why do we do this thing? What's the purpose of it? And then we're going to come to I had three Venn diagrams, and I said we're going to talk about what we believe, what the literature says, and what we do. And the intersection of those 3 is going to be our policy. And we're going to take a long time to discuss all 3 of those things. And so that was my approach to every assessment reform conversation, is if you're not starting with that conversation about why do we grade, like why are you assessing, then you can't get into the how. and the what, because you get to get hung up. Once you come to that understanding of the why, a lot of those barriers go away, and a lot of that resistance goes away. But too often schools are rushing to get to a how or a what, and they don't have the conversation with their community, including parents. And it's very important that parents are involved in this conversation. So my wife and I started an organization called the Assessment and Competency Collaborative. And we basically have created 5 standards for what a standards-based school should look like that's doing it right. And we offer this accreditation to schools that can apply for the accreditation. They submit the evidence. We measure them against our 5 standards and say, yes, you are doing it at the initial level, you're doing it at the standard level, or you're doing it at the advanced level, and then we award certification just to kind of impose order on chaos. But also because we recognize, having worked in schools, that sometimes some obstacles can be kind of nudged out of the way if you say, oh, we have to do this because we want to get the accreditation. And so where there might be a sticking point, we can help massage that sticking point by giving school principals and superintendents the ability to fall back on us and say, well, yeah, but these guys are saying we have to do it, so we have to do it. So that's the Assessment and Competency Collaborative. That's what we're trying to do around assessment reform. And language proficiency is a huge part of that. The idea of that students are being assessed on their proficiency levels, not on did they complete the unit test for chapter 1, right, and so on and so forth, or unit test, unit 1.
James, thank you for that very thorough description and very clear, because part of what we know, those of us that have been in language education, is that we're glad to be in the educational scene with language, but we also know that language being the human experience through which all content comes, that it's a little bit of a square peg, round hole, or vice versa, probably. And it strikes me that what you just said is that assessment and assessment approaches that are creative, that are based on how language works, could potentially be a bit of a opportunity to change the way that language plays a role in curriculum, not to disappear, goodness knows, but to be looked at in the way that it actually is different from content-based items, or should be, working in the direction of the proficiency and competency outcomes. I'm doing that even without a question at the end, because it's such an important moment to be able to say, how do we help people to recognize that the speaking of languages and the learning of multiple languages is a very human experience forever, and that if we have it in the educational scene, we have to take a look at how we approach it and how we indeed assess it in order to recognize its uniqueness. Any of those elements that I've just blathered on there about something that relate to some of the philosophical as well as the practical things that you've been doing?
Yeah, all of them. So you're you're hitting right into the meat of the core of the struggle, is that you have these structures that have been put in place because we decided long ago that's how we were going to measure learning. And there's another podcast I listen to. It's called the Future Learning Design Podcast, and with Tim Logan. And recently he had a guest on that was talking about the loss of indigenous learning in Africa because the colonial powers came in and said, no, this is how you assess. This is how we learn. This is how you assess it. And so all of this indigenous knowledge was considered not important, right? And that in a way, although we didn't have that same experience in the United States because we'd already removed indigenous culture and indigenous learning a long time earlier before we standardized the school system. But we're in this measurement cycle where we can't seem to break out of it unless you do something radical. And then that gets into all kinds of other issues as to who you're serving and, is that what your community needs? And so I think what your point, what you just said, is that the way languages are taught and the way we understand how to measure students' understanding of language was you said square peg round hole. Like we tried to fit that nonlinear process into a linear process. And as a result, we have all these people who say, oh yeah, I took 2 years of Spanish in high school, but I don't remember a word. And that's sad, but also it's fixable, but it does require a stripping down of the entire system. It can't be dealt with in isolation. Dual language programs, yes, like those are places where that is happening. But all too often it stops at fifth grade. It doesn't go on to the middle school, though there is progress happening going on towards middle school and beyond. But yeah, I think the philosophical question you raised is, does the entire system need reform? And my personal philosophy is yes, but also I think we can, once you delve into assessment reform, once your school starts taking that journey and starts looking at and examining the why we grade, all these things that you do start popping up as like, well, why do we do that? Like, that's silly. Like, we've been doing that for 40 years, but why? We never even questioned it. And so once you pull on that thread, it's like, oh, well, this is connected to this, and this is connected to our seat time requirements, which those go out the window. And this is connected to so clearly our attendance policy is no longer valid. And this, what about late work? Well, that goes out. And like all these other things all start collapsing, which scares people. People are very scared. Greg Mullen, who's a great guy, he's one of our stable of advisors for the Assessment Competency Collaborative. He does a lot of stuff on change management. And he's got this graphic where he shows within the circle of change, because there's always a cycle, because once you complete the change, there's new change that needs to be embarked on. But there's a regressive pattern inside that circle. So imagine a big circle going clockwise. Within that circle is a counterclockwise regressive circle, because people go, that's great, let's do it. And then they get into the weeds and they go, oh my gosh, we can't do this. This is a sacred cow, right? And so, but the sacred cow can't stay there anymore because it's getting in the way of all the other things. And so that's scary. And so it has to be an open dialogue, and it has to be the concept that language learning, the way it's being taught, isn't working. We'd like to fix it. We got to fix all these other things too. So why don't we all get together and talk about it rather than it just being one push in one direction? It's the dialogue, which, is language.
It sure is. It sure is. So what do you see coming up in the near future, just in general, on the planet, with regard to language, understanding languages, working with language?
I don't know if I have enough. I'll give a very amateur, like, lover of languages, but not a student of language learning, just a learner of language, but not a student of languages. That I think I know, and I'm going to limit this to my circle of people, is that there are always friends of mine who are coming up and saying, I want to pick up a second language. I have these conversations frequently with people who say, like, oh, can we come down to Costa Rica and, spend a couple of weeks and do language courses down there? And so I don't know if it's just because I've hit that age of 51. I've got friends who are now, similar age, where they've got time on their hands now. Their kids are raised. They're looking back at their life and wishing, like, oh, I wish I had learned this language, or they have more time to travel. But I feel like that's a trend among friends, that there's more interest in learning language, or more interest just in languages in general. And, and I think, I don't know, I'm not being paid by Duolingo, but I think Duolingo is, I don't know how many millions of subscribers they have on it. I have friends who are constantly posting on LinkedIn, like their streaks and not LinkedIn, on Facebook. Nobody posts that on LinkedIn. That's beneath LinkedIn. That's a Facebook post. I'm posting like their streaks in Duolingo, or what's the other one? Link, I think is what it's called. So yeah, in my own circle of friends, and that's a positive trend. People moving more towards language. I don't have enough expertise to address the rest of it. What's going on in the rest of the world? So your other guests are well more positioned to address that.
What do you think that language has to say to a world where there's so many challenges among people, so many things going on, where people are taking a look at pressures and changes and so forth? What does language have to say to people that are looking to their own personal futures?
Yeah, I think you did an episode with some French speakers who were going to Côte d'Ivoire.
Mm-hmm.
Where they were looking at the colonization of language and the French versus Francophone French. And that I remember thinking on that episode, like, wow, there's all of this opportunity for really constructive dialogue with people who speak the same language, but do it from different dialects or with different influences that come up, to talk about shared commonality, that they have a shared language, but there's differences and there's reasons for those differences, right? And, how those evolved. And I think when we're talking about some of this pressure, a lot of it is post-colonial, right? And a lot of it is developing countries attempting to reclaim what was stolen from them and what was forced upon them, but still speaking the colonial powers language, right?
Yeah.
but done slightly differently. I think there's a really good opportunity to enter the conversation in a different way and look at it through. Here's why the people in the DRC in Congo. This is why their French is spoken the way it is due to the history of the Belgians and all the other issues that happened. And these are the experiences, and that it helps those more prior colonial powers, to go, oh, okay, we can have a dialogue about how the language changed because of things that happened. I think that's a good starting point, because I don't think it can get intensely personal. Clearly, like I know a lot of Moroccans who are very upset when you call their language a dialect. That is very offensive to a lot of Moroccans, and they will get into it with you. And so there are lots of flashpoints that could come up, but it's done in this seek to understand, seek to collaborate, and make some collective understanding of how languages have been forced and changed and embedded on people. Even Nahuatl, the Spanish came, they met the Aztecs, they conquered the Aztecs, they started learning their language, and the Nahuatl doesn't fit into the Spanish constructions. So when the friars were writing the dictionaries, translating Nahuatl to Spanish, they changed the format of Nahuatl so that it fit the Spanish construction. And so even though it's not widely spoken anymore, 1.5 million people and me, there was change. So even our professor in the class, he said, like, what I'm teaching was not the language of the Aztecs. He's like, it's the language that was changed by the Spanish. But those are great conversations to have, right? Like those are, and there's a lot of Spanish speakers who are, abiding by the rules set in Madrid. Some of those words were taken from Nahuatl and brought back and put into the royal dictionary. And so like having like, oh, where's the origin of our language? Where's the origin of the colonial powers receiving? How has their language been changed by the authorities or the organizations or countries that they took over? So yeah, that would be my one idea is having discussions between prior colonial and post-colonial powers about how languages have been impacted by the process of being a colony, and how that has led to all kinds of other things. And we can do the American Brit conversation too. Like we can talk about the words that we say purposely differently, thanks to Merriam-Webster, that are said in the UK.
Spelled differently just because, doggone it.
Just because.
I think it's always been fun to listen to folks from Britain and like poor Americans. They don't have enough money to have aluminium. They've lost a whole syllable just because. It's interesting.
I meant to say Noah Webster, not Merriam-Webster. Sorry, Merriam-Webster is the dictionary. Noah Webster was the guy.
We got the guy. We got the Webster guy. It's interesting. I love the way you just did that, James, because we have these little conversations. They're kind of fun conversations on the side. And I know that there are some very serious-minded people listening to this podcast who have done quite a bit of work on this. But imagine if this were to emerge into more of a global phenomenon, where people were able to say, we have an option, a thing going on here that we need to do. The concept of Englishes, the concept, and at least we can say it with the plural being clearly heard in English, Frenches, Spanishes, and so forth, where that is our moment to sit down, have a cup of tea so we don't get all excited, and talk about in a coherent and rational kind of way where we indeed have merged together, and why, and what some of the impacts are, just to understand each other better. Imagine that as a wonderful opportunity to open doors, minds, and opportunities.
Yeah, I think it is that it's that opening minds piece that you just said. I think that I also believe, and this may be naive, but I believe that people always like discovering new things about their language, root words and cognates and portmanteaus and all these other things that come up that I believe for most people, bears some level of interest. That there's something I never knew that. There's a YouTube channel I watch about languages that they're always talking about roots of different words. And I find it's fascinating, but I also, I fully accept that I'm a nerd when it comes to this stuff. But I have to believe in my heart of hearts that most people go, oh yeah, that's cool. That's interesting. So if you can start with that opening of mind, of curiosity, and like, why do they say this? And then getting into that, John McWhorter always talks about, like, there's no right English, right? English is constantly evolving. And although there are those, conventions that are universally accepted or mostly universally accepted, like language is evolving, and what the younger generations are doing to English is just as valid as what Samuel Johnson did to English. Like it's there's still an evolution happening, and it's not finished. It's not a finished product. So I think that's an easy. It's a mildly controversial, but not at the point where you would go to war over it.
Yeah.
But it can lead to understanding.
Well, that would be a relief to have that, and that whole language is alive. It's alive.
Yep, exactly.
Wonderful concept in general. James, let's take a look at the fact that you have been very patient answering a variety of questions and also just giving us such great insights. But before we pull it together, I want you to say to yourself, okay, this is fine, but I have this to say before we're done. I want to make sure we're not done with this conversation today until I've had Norah's listeners hear this from me, understand this from me. It can be a re-emphasis of what you've already done, or it can be something brand new that I just didn't ask you about that is on your heart.
Thanks for that opportunity. I didn't come on today with any sort of mission or prime directive, so I don't have anything at the ready. But through the course of our conversation, I think the theme that really kind of got pulled together is that the way we learn language, if we're open to learning language, and that's a whole other separate piece, but as educators and as learners of language and as promoters of multilingualism, that if we push towards that language learning is a good thing, but it should be done in the learner's own speed and when the learner is ready to do it. And for whatever motivates that student to do it, or learner, or lifelong learner. I know there's a story that I think Linda Ignatz tells about a kid who learned German because they were gaming with their friends, and the guys they gamed with were all German speakers. So the kid went and taught himself German so he could talk crap to the kids. Whatever your motivation happens to be, but when it's the right time, you'll engage in it, and people will leap over buildings to learn a language that they desperately want to learn, even if it happens to be in another language or a third language and a second language. They'll still go and spend the time. And so yeah, that would be my one takeaway is let's make learning language a goal, but let's not make it so that it's linear, and let it happen and occur naturally so that people want to continue learning those languages and want to keep using them in whatever way possible. So that would be my axe to grind. But you forced me into it because I didn't have one in the first place.
There you go. So I force you into it. And I'm going to add to the fact that to just ask you to one more personal item on your LinkedIn page. You have the graphic that demonstrates Ikigai. And could you describe what Ikigai is and why you have it as the predominant visual that goes along with your identity? Okay. So for those who aren't familiar with Ikigai, it's a Japanese concept. It was developed by, I just forgot his name. I think he's Canadian. Into this Venn diagram. I have the name. I'll send you the name. We can insert the audio link in later. But basically, if you imagine 4 Venn diagrams, and one is do what you love. Second one is do what you're good at. Do what the world needs, and do what you can get paid for, or remuneration of some sort, right? And so if you put those 4 together, that's what you're supposed to do. Is that a piece of the center is what you're supposed to be doing. And for most of my career, I thought that was being an educator in a formal setting, either in a school as a teacher, and then later when I got dragged kicking and screaming into administration, and then discovered that I actually enjoyed it. So those 2 things were what I thought my point was. And then I just got very disillusioned with the system that I was forced to promote and support. Just the whole system, not just a particular aspect of it, just the concept of schooling, and realized that what I really should be promoting is learning. So then I said, okay, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. I resigned at the ripe young age of 47. And now my Ikigai is to change the system. The problem is the getting paid to do that part isn't so strong. So it's what the world needs. It's what I'm good at. It's what I love to do. Getting paid to do it, not always part of the 4th leg of the stool is sometimes not always there, but I enjoy the work that I do get to do, and I enjoy the people that I get to do it with, and it's constantly learning and growing myself. And so I keep that Ikigai on my LinkedIn page because it's that reminder that when I think, oh man, I should just go get like a 9-to-5 job and do, I think back, that's not what I'm supposed to be doing though. I'm in that center piece right there. That's what I should be doing. So it's a constant reminder. And I cannot remember the guy who came up with the graphic, but
I'll figure it out. I have them
You
somewhere
will.
in a
You
chat.
will. You will. That's great. You will. And thank you. Thank you for describing what, but especially the why in your case. That's really great. Good luck with everything. Good luck with
Thanks. Appreciate
everything
it.
that you're doing. Thanks for joining us for this conversation, and I hope that what you heard helps you to spend time reflecting at what it means to be human and learning the original language or languages that you began with in your life, brand new languages, and especially how it feels to connect to others through the amazing miracle of language. Spend some time thinking about why your story is unique, why your story can instill joy, wonder, and curiosity in others. Come and join me. Take a look at fluency.consulting and let's share our stories together.